Whitney King is the Miselis, is that the proper? Oh, Professor of Chemistry at Colby College. Trained as an environmental scientist, Professor King teaches analytical and environmental chemistry at Colby. Professor King and his students have been working in the Belgrades for over a decade, supported by the National Science Foundation, the Belgrade Lakes Association, Colby College, and the Maine Lakes Resource Center. For the last year, he's been leading an expanded water quality initiative across the entire Belgrade Lakes watershed. We welcome Professor King to our gathering. Say nothing of the reason, use the reason we're here.
Yeah. So Maggie Nutt wanted me to mention that there are refreshments in the back, and you should help yourself. If the blood sugar starts to dip, you have free license to head toward the back and get some refreshments.
In hour 3? In hour 3?
No, minute 42. Okay, so I need to make some acknowledgments. This is the research crew that actually collected all the work. Brenda is standing right next to this pole. So thank you very much. And she can answer all the hard questions. Yeah, right. And as was mentioned in the introduction, this work was funded by both the National Science Foundation, Colby College, the conservation groups here, and Tom Greenstein, who basically funded this whole crew for the last summer. So thanks to everyone that has supported this work. So tonight we're going to sort of give you a synthesis of what we found in the last year. We're going to take a little bit of a different approach. We're not going to just sit there and go through the data graphs. We're going to sort of do a big picture synthesis. And then at the end, the slides I won't show you are all the data graphs that talk about what's happening in each lake. And so let's begin with the first question. Has the water quality in the Belgrades declined in the last 20 years? And the answer is an unequivocal yes. So this is a map of Great Pond, and I'm going to switch between Great Pond and Long Pond and Salmon as I go through this presentation. So this is a map of Great Pond, and you can see Hoyt's Island right here. And the blue area is the dead area, the anoxic area, the zero oxygen area of the lake in 1983. So in 1983, there was essentially oxygen from the surface to the bottom of Great Pond. And this is the same map, but now it's 1988. And you can see that the blue area has now expanded out, and the green area is the area, the dead zone of the lake in 1988. And this is the area now. So it is now 35 times larger than it was back in the early 80s. And it constitutes now about 30 to 40% of the total volume, total surface area of the lake. So there's this expanding anoxia that's happened on Great Pond, and this is mirrored in many of the other lakes. So Salmon and East Pond, even though people don't think of East Pond as going anoxic, East Pond also goes anoxic. It just goes anoxic for short periods of time in a very intense way. And anoxia is bad. Okay, so that's the other part. Anoxia is bad because, and anoxia is the lack of oxygen, right, at the bottom of the water. Anoxia is bad because it A, kills fish, 2, promotes internal nutrient loads. We'll talk a lot about that tonight. And because of these nutrient loads, it produces blooms. And so you can see the difference between North Pond and East Pond, and the difference in these two lakes was really a short anoxic event, which then pulls nutrients out of the sediments in East Pond, and those nutrients can promote algae. And you can see this impact from an aerial photograph. You can almost see the algae windrows on the lake. The other thing we should talk about is that rapid change is possible in all of our lakes. And this is data from East Pond, collected by the Volunteer Lake Monitoring Program, and that's an incredible resource in everything I'm going to talk about tonight, because it gives us a lens to look back from current work back almost 40 years. So this is years since 1975, so we've got 40 years of data. And on this axis, it's Secchi transparency, or Secchi depth. You're going to lower this disc down until you can't see it anymore. And in East Pond in the early 70s, the Secchi transparency was about 4 to 5 meters, and on the worst years, it was around 3 meters. And the problem with a Secchi transparency sort of in this region is that's what the light looks like as the Secchi transparency goes from 3 to 4 meters up to 1 to half a meter, right? You're standing in the lake, wading into the lake, and you can't see your feet. And I'm going to make the case that that transition on East Pond didn't happen slowly, but it actually happened pretty abruptly. And we can decide where you want to draw this step function, but it really, sometime in the 80s, the lake went from being the sort of traditional East Pond with good water clarity to periods of time when East Pond is actually pretty green, and interestingly also periods when East Pond is really clear. Velocity goes back and forth. And we can talk more about that at the end of the presentation. The important piece is that rapid change is possible, and I'm going to argue it's possible in all of our lakes. East Pond, we experienced this rapid change, and we're now living with the consequence of it for the last 25 years. But the concern is whether that type of rapid change can happen on other lakes. So, should we be alarmed? And I will answer yes. East Pond and Salmon Lake already bloom in most years. Not every year, but many years. This is an interesting one. I'm going to suggest that 50% chance Great Pond has a significant bloom in the next 10 years. Business as usual, 50% chance. We can have a debate about whether that's 20% or 80%, but I think the chance is not zero. And this is an interesting conversation. Do we wait until it blooms, or do we take the cautionary tale from East Pond and take preventative measures? And I actually think the North Basin of Long Pond could bloom sooner. So if you look at these lakes, Long Pond, I'm more worried about Long Pond than I am about Great Pond. So reversing the trends will require, in some ways, an unprecedented community commitment. I think that's fair to say. And so what we'd like to do is think about, what would that reverse be like? What would success be? And I'm going to suggest that success on Great Pond might be getting the water quality back to the way it was in 1983. Okay? Back to the point where the anoxia was just a little teeny bit at the bottom of the lake. But every lake really has to define what success is. Because in the end, there's going to be a lot of effort, an unprecedented community commitment to getting to success, and I think there's going to need to be agreement. So, in my conversations with all the various conservation groups out here, I've said, what do you consider success? And that's going to be different from every lake. But I think it's a good place to start as we think about moving forward. So, what does an unprecedented community commitment require? Academic resources. This is a little self-serving. A formal Colby local community partnership. And we're starting to have these conversations. And when I mean formal, I mean having collaboration between the researchers here and the researchers on campus in a more formal way so that we can amplify that type of partnership. And that type of partnership now allows us to go out and raise a lot of both private and public grant support. Active engagement with the DEP, towns, community conservation groups, general residents. I need to make a plug for DEP. Linda Bacon and her team have been an incredible resource, and Brenda's shaking her head. They've just been fantastic in all the work we've been doing in the last year. They come out, they train the students, they make sure that they're following the correct protocols, and they're great at looking and thinking about the data. We're going to need technical and scientific engineering experience. Now you can hire that, or you can build it in-house, or you can do a bit of both, but we're going to need to expand our capabilities, particularly on the engineering side, if we end up thinking about engineered solutions toward lake restoration. And then, and this is an area that I have less experience in. We're going to need behavioral and educational expertise. We're going to need to know how do we interact with the community. What motivates people? Naggy, shaking your head, yes, but yes. But we're going to need to understand what motivates people to change their behavior, and how do we communicate this to a broad audience. So essentially, the constituency. So now I want to talk a little bit. So what are the aspects? What's going on in the lake? What's the model, and how do we use this model to understand the data I'm about to show you? So let's start with a pristine lake. Okay, pristine lake has a warm layer in the summer at the top of the lake. We call that the epilimnium. It has a cold bottom layer. Okay, we're going to call that the hypolimnium. And it's got a thermocline, a boundary between the two, where the temperature changes abruptly. Okay, in a pristine lake, the inflow of water balances the outflow of water, and the inflow of nutrients balances the outflow of nutrients. So you end up with a low nutrient lake, and that low nutrient lake provides sufficient plankton to support a healthy fish population, and the cold water fish can live in the lake because there's actually oxygen in the bottom of the lake. So that's a healthy lake. The oxygen profile in this healthy lake goes from reasonably high in the surface, even higher at depth. And that's because deep, cold water, more oxygen dissolves in cold water than warm water. So if you go look at Clearwater Lake up near Skowhegan, you'll see an oxygen profile that looks like this. So low oxygen, well, this is around 8 parts per million, and it goes up to about 12 parts per million as you go down into the water column. So that's sort of the gold standard, if you will, in our lakes. The other thing about a pristine lake is that eventually some of the nutrients are going to end up in the sediment, and these nutrients are bound up by the metals in the sediment, and the metals we're going to carry about are aluminum and iron. So iron 3 and aluminum 3, these act as the chemical sponges that hold the nutrients at the bottom of the lake, and that's going to become really important later on at the top. All right, so let's look at an impacted lake. Looks like a little cut off at the top. That says impacted lake. And in an impacted lake, there's not a balance between inflow and outflow. We're putting in more nutrients than are leaving. This causes an increase in nutrient concentration in the surface. The oxygen profile now goes the other direction. So we have, again, about 8 parts per million oxygen in the surface, but it decreases with depth. And I didn't draw this correctly, it's just a sketch. This oxygen concentration doesn't just decrease, it goes to 0 on this lake, and I'll show that to you. So now what we have is the same warm water at the top, the same cold water, the thermocline boundary, but instead of having high oxygen in the bottom water, we have low oxygen. And that low oxygen now allows us to dissolve the sediments, and when we dissolve the sediments, we release the phosphorus that's bound to the iron, and we get iron and phosphorus built up in the sediments. And we call that internal load. Now these nutrients, this phosphorus that's now been released from the sediments, can trigger algae blooms in the surface. Now we've got to get them up to the surface, and so the timing of that depends on the lake and the size and the wind, but that's basically a major source of nutrients to these lakes. So one of the questions that we've been trying to answer is, how important is this load in this nutrient balance? Okay, so where's the lake phosphorus coming from? It's coming from 2 sources, external sources. This is where all the phosphorus originally came from. That external sources include streams, camp roads, shoreline, septic, right? All the stuff around the lake, the phosphorus was carried in. However, if we put in too much, it ends up in the sediment. And now we have a historical phosphorus load that's now in the sediments, and it builds up. And in an oxic lake, it gets bound by the iron and the aluminum, but high iron relative to aluminum in the sediments can cause a release. So there's our challenge, and if we release it under low oxygen conditions, we promote internal loading. So external loading is the phosphorus coming from the shoreline and all the human activity around the shore. That's okay at a certain level, but when it becomes excessive, you can trigger internal loading, and that's what we're worried about. Now we exceed the phosphorus balance of the lake. Okay, so the project's goal was to document current water quality status of the lakes. We knew that water was declining, however, we had gaps in the data, and so our job was to try to fill in those gaps. At the same time, we want to have an educational campaign to make the community aware of what we're doing, and in part, that's what I'm doing tonight. And then convene and manage a committee made up of representatives from the whole watershed constituencies to complete a comprehensive water quality plan. And that's really in our future. That's the next sort of step. The important thing is that the work that I'm going to describe tonight, we did a lot of the analysis, but it was also a really good collaborative effort between the MLRC, the BRCA, Colby, DEP, and lots of volunteer hours on the lakes. And this turned out to be a really nice aspect of this work. So we had many votes on many lakes, taking the students out, interacting with the community. My students really enjoyed it, and I hope the volunteers did as well. This is Linda Bacon teaching everybody how to take Secchi discs. This is Brenda working in the lab, and then these are some of the instruments that we use for doing the water quality analysis. So just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the project, we sampled all of the Belgrade Lakes between 18 and 20 times. So that was probably 500,000 measurements. We had lots of support from Colby, trucks, boats, instrumentation, reagents, and then this work was supported by myself and my colleague Denise Brusewitz. And Colby's buoy is sitting here, purchased with college funds. Okay, and the other thing is we had a pretty active, very active community and public relations initiative. And this included community involved in the sample collection. I mentioned the volunteers, I think that was important. And then again, I want to put a plug in for that collaboration with DEP. Okay, so let's look at some data. So, this is a slide I think many of you have seen before. This is it's called a hypsograph, or the shape, of all of the lakes and the water flow between each of the lakes as you move through the Belgrade chain. So the shape of this little cup is the scaled size of each lake. So East Pond is small, slightly smaller than North Pond. Both East and North are quite a bit smaller than Great Pond. And this axis is depth. So you can see Great Pond's about 20 meters deep. And if you go to Salmon and Long, that's Snow and Long, they're about 30 meters deep. And you can actually see the shape of the lakes changing. You might think of the Great Pond as kind of a big margarita glass, where Snow Pond's more like a champagne flute. And that has impacts in the way wind mixes the water. A good rule of thumb is that the deep water in all of these lakes is about 10% of the volume. And the deep water is shown by this red line. The thermocline in my pristine and impacted lakes is shown on each of these lakes. So East Pond, the thermocline is about 1 meter off the bottom. North Pond never really has a thermocline. And then in Great Pond, it's somewhere between 8.5 and 10 meters. Okay? And so, but it's interesting that in almost all the lakes, irrespective of the size, about 90% of the water is above the thermocline and 10% of the water is below the thermocline. So that's going to become important when we look at some profiles later on. All right, so let's look at one profile. This is from Great Pond. It is, and I'm going to take you through the axes. This is depth going from the surface down. Limnologists and oceanographers plot things backwards, right? So we want to give you sort of a picture from the top of the lake, moving down. This is date. So we started in early May, we went out through the end of October. This is the good time to sample. This is the not so good time to sample, because it's cold. Each dot on this plot is a sample point. So there was an instrument that was collecting, in this case, temperature as a function of depth at different dates. And you can see the red, if you're sitting in the front, is hot. So this is 78 degrees Fahrenheit, and the blue is cold, 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And there's a thermocline right there. And the thermocline is the zone where the temperature is changing the fastest. Right? So our thermocline on Great Pond last summer was at about 8.5 meters, and it's pretty constant over the whole summer. So that's the temperature. And this is the oxygen. Okay, so same axes, day, depth, thermocline. This is the oxygen concentration. Normal up here, 8 parts per million. This dark blue is 0. Right? So everything is dead from July 30th through the end of October. Right? There's no oxygen in the bottom of the lake. That's supposed to be a dead lake trout. Okay? There's no fish in the bottom of the lake at this point. And for the data wonks, and I'm getting cut off here, there's not much I can do about it. What we also care about is not just is the oxygen missing, but how much is missing. Because one of the things people talked about is if you want to fix the lake, let's put the oxygen back in. Well, how much oxygen do you actually need to add? And so what you can do is you can take the amount of missing oxygen, you can multiply it by the volume, and you can calculate how much oxygen is actually missing. Remember, 10% of the volume is in the deep water, 90% is at the surface. So we could do that calculation, and the oxygen is actually missing. Most of the oxygen is missing in this zone right here, between 8.5 and 13 meters on Great Pond, and it starts going away. Actually, starts going away right in May, and it continues to go away until the fall mixing. So we can actually calculate how fast is the oxygen going away, and the answer is 2 tons per day. Oxygen's going away at 2 tons per day. Just put that in perspective, that's all the oxygen in this room times 25. Okay, so if we took all the oxygen in this room, a room 25 times this size, that's the amount of oxygen we need to put into the lake every day, starting really early in May, continuing all the way through the fall, if we want to keep the lake well oxygenated. And this 2 tons a day is relatively constant through history, but if we go back to 1989, I just sketched it on here, this is what 1989 looks like. You still lost 2 tons a day, we just only lost it for a few days. The lake never really went anoxic. It did start going away until much later in the summer. This transition has much slower, or it went away at the same speed, but it was much shorter in duration, and so we didn't go as anoxic. So this is the trend, right? We're going increasing, longer duration of anoxia. So the anoxic extent, low oxygen extent, is 35 times greater today than it was in 1989. And how do we know that? We actually went through all 40 years of DEP data, and we did this analysis. We picked the years where we had 4 or 5 good profiles. So we couldn't do it on years we only had 1 or 2 profiles, but everywhere we had 4 or 5 profiles, we could look at the trajectory of oxygen over time, and then we could calculate how much oxygen was missing, and we could calculate the anoxic extent. We basically build this map for every year, and we have usually 8 or 9 years over those 40 where we have enough data. And this is what the data looks like. This is anoxic days or anoxic factor versus time. And I'm going to argue that in the 80s and 90s, we had a small dead zone. This number is 0.2. Okay. And today, we have a much bigger dead zone. This number is 7. And so there's a 35% increase, 35 times, 35-fold increase in anoxia. So that's a lot, right? And that expanded anoxia means that we can now start to interrogate the sediments. We can start to interact with the sediments to promote internal load.
Whitney, you suggesting it's plateaued toward the later years?
Yeah, I don't know what it's doing. Maybe this should be a optimistic smiley face as opposed to a question mark. I don't know. So clearly, something happened in 2009. So I don't think this is an experimental artifact. We would have to have a lot of profiles that just are wrong. Notice we had lots of years where we didn't include the data.
It rained all summer in 2009. It really did.
Oh, that's interesting.
It did. It rained all
Summer
summer.
in 2009. That actually would make sense. And the lakes went out late. So maybe 2009 is actually real, right? And so now what happens if the ice goes out early? So the interesting question is what's going to happen in 2016, right? And how is that going to work? But there's clearly been an increase, and a pretty dramatic increase, and that's the concern, right? So the concern, if you just take a snapshot in time, just 1 year, and you look at it, you might say, oh, okay, it's only an anoxic factor of 7, and the literature says that's kind of on the edge between good and concern. What concerns me more is how rapidly it's actually changed, and we don't know what's going to happen in 2016, but we'll know soon enough. Yeah.
I just have a question on your methodology. For the recent data that you collected, were you collecting oxygen profiles in the greater extent of the lake versus just the deep hole that?
We're actually just doing them, all of them were collected at one of the 2 DEP holes. So we're making an assumption that horizontal transport is pretty fast relative to vertical transport. And we actually know from this summer's work that the west side of Hoyt's Island and the east side of Hoyt's Island, so I'll focus on Grapevine because we have this island down the middle, they parallel each other very closely. There are times where they're slightly different, and Brenda, you're shaking your head, but they're very close. Not only in the oxygen concentrations and in the temperature, but the phosphorus concentrations are almost, you can almost take the 2 profiles and lay them right on top of each other. Dan?
Yeah, Whitney, you showed, on one graph, you showed that most of the decline in oxygen, the biggest anoxic was right below the thermocline.
Yeah.
But not extending necessarily to the bottom.
That's because we multiply it by volume. So we lose most of the oxygen at the bottom of the lake, but the moles of oxygen that are missing is the concentration difference times the volume. Because my lake has an exponential tail, there's very little water at 22 meters.
Right.
It doesn't contribute to the total mass of missing oxygen the same way the 10-meter water does.
But the amount of substrate at the bottom that's under the amount of phosphorus that's going to be released out of the substrate is a function of the amount of substrate you have.
Yep. So you have to also worry about the sediment surface area. Yeah, and you can actually do that. And so, but the lake is big enough that you can pretty much project the area. You don't have to worry about the edges of the box, right? You can just think of this as a flat plane, just because it's big relative to the depth. It's kilometers versus meters. Yeah. Okay, so now let's go back and let's think about what's happening with this now increased oxygen demand, this increased anoxia, right? Our pristine lake is sort of what our gold standard is. That was supposed to be a bad golden pond pun. Okay, compared to our impacted lake, right? Which is now, we have now low oxygen in the bottom of the lake. And if we have low oxygen, we can dissolve this iron phosphate complex that puts phosphorus into the bottom of the lake, and we worry about this internal load. And so what evidence do we have of this internal load? Well, we can actually now go into the lake and we can look for iron and phosphorus, and we can also look at the sediments and we can see how much iron and phosphorus do the sediments hold. So let's use salmon lake, and it says salmon pond oxygen. It says salmon pond oxygen plot on the top, that's what's cut off. This is depth, so I'm now on a slightly shallower lake. This is the dates, so these are the dates we actually went out into salmon. This is the oxygen concentration. It looks almost identical to Great Pond, and then I have high oxygen, in this case above 6 meters, okay, everywhere here, and low oxygen down here. So the dark is low oxygen. And the dots on this lake are the iron concentrations. So we don't have the ability to produce the high resolution that we do with our oxygen sensor, but we took a lot of samples, and then we analyzed them in the laboratory, and the units are parts per billion. And so the concentration of iron in the surface ranges, interestingly, in the spring, around 80 parts per billion, and it goes to around 20. We can talk about what's going on there. But look, as we get down into the deep water, the concentrations go from 20 to 2,000, right? There's a 100-fold increase in iron concentration. Well, where did the iron come from? It has to be, right? Because you can't skip the middle of the lake, so the iron has to be coming up from the sediments. And you can look at the low oxygen water, and right on the edge of the low oxygen is where the iron concentration decreases. And that's because when iron hits oxygen, it precipitates, and then it gets carried back down. iron in the sediments. Now, if the iron's being released, you'd expect that the phosphorus would be released. And it is. Okay, so this is now phosphorus in ppb in Salmon Lake. And the rule of thumb that Roy Bouchard will give you is 12 parts per billion is the tipping point in lakes. And so we're seeing 10, 13, 7, 9. We're right on the edge of the tipping point on Salmon Lake. In fact, salmon is pretty green the second half of the summer. It doesn't have the Anabina bloom, it has green algae, but its second transparency is not great. So we're right on the boundary here. And then you get into the deep water, 130, 110, 158. We have a lot of phosphorus. Now, it's not going out 1 to 1. We get about 1 phosphorus for 10 irons, but it's still a lot. And so this is the evidence for the significant internal load in the bottom of the lake. And now you can do some fun things, like you can say, well, how do these compare? This is phosphorus in Salmon Lake at all depths versus the iron in Salmon Lake at all depths. And there's a beautiful relationship here, and that's because the phosphorus in the lake's coming from the internal load. It's not 100% coming from the internal load. Down here, oh, the red line, that's where the lake blooms. All right? 12 parts per billion is down here. And this part of the lake down in here, that's kind of the normal, pristine lake. That's the range of iron and phosphorus that we'd expect. And then all this part, this is the internal load. Now, remember the rule of thumb, the deep water is only 10% of the volume. So to be fair, you need to take this number and divide it by 10. Okay, so good. Take 10, divide 250 by 10, that's 25. And that's bad news, right? You're now way above the threshold for blooms, and we get a bloom. What we're worried about is the acceleration of this process. So right now, we're kind of holding our own on salmon, but if anything tends to increase that internal load, you could be in for a rough season.
So is it blooming in the fall then?
It is. Yeah. And it's different. It's a different organism than you get in East Pond, but yeah, it's blooming. Oh, and this is Long Pond. So this is the same type of plot on Long Pond. Notice the scales are different. I should point this out. This is 300. Good news is Long Pond is 50. Okay? And this is the sort of zone where a natural lake would be sort of in the range from 0 to 10. Low iron concentrations. That's the limit. That's the Roy Bouchard benchmark for a healthy lake. And you can see that in the bottom water of Long Pond, we're getting significant internal load. Probably on the order of 30+%. That was one of the questions we had. And we had to do some more careful studies to quantify that. But it's significant. And so, this is my piece from the sediment graph. The iron-bound phosphorus is being released into this water as anoxia proceeds.
Could you explain the context of about 30%?
So what that means is that 30% of the phosphorus that's in the lake at any one time is coming from this internal load as opposed to coming from the external load. And that has significant remediation implications because the external load is actually harder from an engineering standpoint to manage. You're managing the camp roads and the shoreline. And the internal load, you can do things about it. You can add aluminum. And because aluminum doesn't release its phosphorus under low oxygen conditions, but iron does. So we'll talk about the iron to aluminum ratio here in a second. All right, so if we want to understand how the sediments are releasing phosphorus, to what extent they're releasing phosphorus, we need to get some sediments. And we probably have the core sitting in the lab. We can pull it out at the end. So this is us on one of the lakes. This is a small piston core. We actually lower it down, we stick it in the mud, and then this just becomes a sort of like a big tube, and we're pushing the sediment up through the top, and then we take the very fine top 2 centimeters of the sediment, and we collect that, and then we freeze it, and then we take it into the lab, and we simulate the chemical environment of an anoxic lake. And so we do that by adding dithionate. We basically expose the sediment to reducing conditions, low oxygen conditions. And then what do? We measure the release of iron, aluminum, and phosphorus. So now what we have is not only the evidence from the actual water in the bottom of the lake, but we can actually see how much capacity does the sediment have to hold on to iron or to release iron. And this is the result from all the sediment samples in all of the lakes. This is the phosphorus concentration released when we take those sediments and make them anoxic. This is the iron concentration that's released when we take those sediments and make them anoxic. Notice the trend looks kind of just like Salmon Lake and Long Pond. The slope is about 3 times higher. So this chemical process we do in the lab is probably a little more aggressive at releasing iron, but we're taking a slurry and shaking it up. And so we're really extracting the maximum amount of phosphorus out of it. But the trend is remarkably consistent. And we can do the same thing for aluminum versus phosphorus, and we don't get that relationship. The aluminum holds on to the phosphorus, the iron releases it. So there's a way to think about the relationship between iron, aluminum, and phosphorus. And the way the geochemists think about this is they look at, and this is out of Pesner's paper, they look at the iron to aluminum ratio. And basically the evidence, so all the open circles and black dots are data from other lakes. And what they find is that at an aluminum to iron ratio of 3 to 1, if you have more than 3 times the aluminum, it holds on to phosphorus, grabs it. And that's why people add alum to lakes. You add alum to lakes, alum is a aluminum sulfate. So you take aluminum sulfate, you add it to the lake, and it binds the phosphorus. And because aluminum doesn't release the phosphorus when it goes anoxic, it holds on to the phosphorus. And so standard treatment for a lake is you add alum to it. And if you add alum, you take a sample that's down here and you move it out here, because you're basically coating the lake with a fine layer of aluminum. Okay, it's done very successfully at many lakes across the country.
How long do you hang on to it?
20 years. Okay, and it's not really that the aluminum let go, it's that other sediments covered up. Okay, so, but you know, rule of thumb, 20 years.
Is that what happened in China, though? Wasn't there other issues?
Well, in China, they
Wasn't it considered a failure?
they didn't add enough aluminum.
Oh.
So if you're going to do this, you can't go cheap.
Well, I just want to be clear and transparent about all the facts.
Yeah, so the answer is, Maine's done it, I think, 4 times. They've tried this 4 times.
Yeah, that's good.
4. Yeah, 4. Right? And I think it's been successful 3 out of 4.
Yeah.
Okay? But I mean, you know, I think it's fair to say that you've got to add enough aluminum. And so if you add enough aluminum, you're shifting this ratio. And this is phosphorus release on this axis, and this is the iron to aluminum ratio on this axis. So if you park your lake out here, you are resistant to internal load. This is all the colored points are our lake samples. Every single sample we measured had a iron to aluminum ratio or an aluminum to iron ratio, doesn't matter. It's all below 1. Okay? These lake samples are all highly susceptible to internal load. And all of them are on there except the point that got cut off. I had one Great Pond sample where the phosphorus release was 140. And it's right at the edge, it's right at the edge of the thermocline. So it's right at 9 meters. So all of our data clusters right in this zone where we have significant release under anoxic conditions. No kidding, that's what the salmon and Long Pond data tells us.
Are there any negative consequences to the amount of alum that you add?
Yeah, if you add the alum wrong, you can really mess up the pH of the lake, and if you mess up the pH of the lake, you can kill fish, you can do all sorts of other things. I mean, it's like anything else, you've got to be careful. So our lakes have a fairly low alkalinity, that's the ability to buffer against pH swings, and so you have to add the aluminum in the right ratio of acid and base so that you don't shift the pH too high or too low. And you also want to have the aluminum at the right pH so that it precipitates out and coats the bottom and doesn't dissolve. And so the folks that do this, they do actually what are called jar tests. They take sediment and they take water and they line up a whole bunch of jars to simulate little lakes, and then they add different amounts of aluminum in different conditions and they try to find the best recipe to work. So they're pretty good at this. It's empirical, but it's they're pretty good at doing this. Because killing fish is bad for business if you're in the job of putting aluminum in lakes. So they're commercial companies. This is like hiring a company that fertilizes your lawn. That's probably a bad thing to say. Okay. It's like hiring someone that paints your house, right? You don't want them to use a toxic paint on your house, and you want the aluminum applicators to be responsible as well.
And if you add aluminum, do human beings notice anything different when they're kayaking or swimming?
Well, the aluminum's going to be hopefully on the bottom of the lake. Okay, I mean, it's really going to be on the bottom of the lake. And so aluminum at high concentrations, like almost every chemical, is toxic. But at the concentrations we're talking about, it should be absolutely fine. So you're not killing any fish, you're not doing anything, so it should be fine.
And you're also not going to add it throughout the entire lake. You're only going to add it to those areas that are going anoxic.
Yeah, probably 50% a great one. It's deep here.
Right.
Yeah.
They also add it, they can add it at depths. I mean,
Oh,
it's not
interesting.
going to spread necessarily.
So they can stick the dispenser down.
Basically drag 2 weeks.
Okay. Because everyone I've seen, you can see the plume behind the barge.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not saying that that won't happen, but the majority of it is going into the water
At depth.
deeper than the surface.
Yeah. And there would be a real advantage to that, because if you can get it deeper, you don't have to worry about it going across the thermocline. You'd really like to add it below the thermocline if you could.
So,
Yeah, Kathy.
So did I hear you say that long time, it's only 30% that is internal load, and the other 70% is external?
That's a good estimate at this point.
Okay, so
But that-
even if you do animal in long time, you're only taking care of 30%.
Well,
Load.
you've got to be careful. That's true, but if you're right at the balancing point, okay? So if you were to drop the dam out here 30%, the lake level goes down. Right, so what you're talking about is, you're not talking about a concentration, you're talking about change in flux, not a change in concentration. So the analogy would be if you were to drop the dam's 12 feet high, if you were to drop the dam a certain height, the whole lake level is going to come down to reach that new equilibrium point. So if you can take out a big piece of the phosphorus cycle, you will drop the total phosphorus concentration in the lake. You'd want to model that. You'd want to be careful in modeling that, and that would come into your decision. So I'm not, yeah.
Still have the external load coming in every year.
Every year. Well, you also have the internal load shut off every year.
Right.
Right. So you gotta model this, and you gotta think about what the implications are, and that's, I'm not gonna give you that solution tonight.
How this is communicated to the broader community has to be done really careful, otherwise you'll end up justifying avoid any future efforts at reducing soil erosion control or phosphorus runoff from development.
That's right. Is that what you're gonna say, Maggie?
Well, I wanted to.
Yeah. So the best, what got us into this problem was the external load, right? The reason we're here is because we had excessive external load, which is now trapped in the sediments, giving us the internal load. If you're going to invest in the lake, you want to preserve your investment. And the best way to preserve your investment is to do both.
That, I mean, Kathy's 2 questions point to this, that you get 20 years to change the behavior of everybody who owns property in the watershed. You put your money in the lake, and then you've got some time to build the resilience.
But I agree with George too, and I think you have to be very specific and very careful about how you present it to municipalities and how you present it to, this is a very rarefied group of people around here that understand conservation, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole bunch out there that are not there yet.
All right, so you're making my point of the, yeah.
Early on, you showed a slide and you broke down the outside forms, streams, shoreline, septic, and roads.
Yep.
What percentage would you roughly give to either any of those? Which is the worst?
DEP says that gravel roads are responsible for 60% of the degradation of water.
Are these gravel
In
roads
Maine.
the ones that are like 10 feet from the water, or are they?
No, they tend to be roads that come from the highland where the main roads are, straight down toward the lake, which is where people put their camps.
You get your runoff.
You get your runoff there.
And they're all ditched to carry the water,
Right.
the sediment, right?
Yeah. So that's probably number one. Then you can make a case that there's some shoreline behavior that's could be up there and would be highly variable.
Should be visible.
Should be.
If people have a beautiful lawn right up to the.
Okay, so that's the fertilizer part, right? So hopefully nobody's fertilizing. And then the other piece is septics. Septics is a big question mark, and highly variable. A well-designed septic, we thought Brickett Point was going to be a problem on Ace Pond. They did some experiments on the septic there, and they found the septics are in great shape, and they're not contributing phosphorus. You got that right, Charlie, didn't I?
Correct.
So but 60% is the roads. That's actually not a bad place to start, right? All right, so here we go. Should we be alarmed? Yes. Right? I think we've got some real issues, and what I'm most concerned about is the trajectory. It's the trajectory that I think we should be most alarmed about. Reversing the trends will require an unprecedented community commitment. This group is clearly committed, but we need to think about how we expand that group, how we expand our community. Key questions to inform solutions. Was 2015 representative? What do you think? Yeah. Is any year representative? Well, so we could, I suspect 2016 is going to be quite a bit different than 2015. So probably we need to get out there and take a look this year. We probably will tweak what we're doing. One of the things that we're going to do is collect some sediment samples before the lake stratifies. We need to get some samples in April while the sediments have been oxygenated all winter. And then we need to compare those to the fall data that we have and be able to sort of assess where that's going. So that's number one. Internal versus external load models by lake. We need to beef up those models. We need to really understand what those models are telling us, and that's the greater than 30% number. We need to assess the community interest and capacity. I think that's the polite word for money, right? But capacity is true. It's not only financial capacity, but it's intellectual capacity. It's willingness to work collaboratively. And then I think it's really important that we have some metric to define success. It's one thing to say we're cleaning up the lakes. I like this. I would like Lake X to be, I'm coming to the sense of place, like I remember it when I was a kid, like it was in 1983. It's something that I think people carry with them. It's a tangible goal that we can communicate. I think it helps us with the communications part. All right, so these are the resources that we started with, and I still think these are going to be the resources that we're going to need to marshal. And this is my last slide, and it's a plea for all of you that are interested to help tell the full story. So you got my story, but you didn't get the story, right? It's one thing for me to come to a group and tell you what I think's going on, but we really need to get people to look at the data, to say, I like this graph, I don't like this graph, and in the process of creating the graphs and wrestling with the data, people start to own the process. Excuse me. It's a good thing it's the last slide. So this is something that, and Maggie and I were talking about this beforehand. We need to sit down, and I've got all the lake data for all the lakes. There's 70 more slides, and I'm not going to show them to you. But that's the important part.